After thousands of federal convicts were released from prison to home confinement during the peak of the COVID pandemic, Biden's legal team has decided to force them back to prison. They have exactly 1 month to report once the official COVID state of emergency ends.
Several officials have called the decision, quote, the best interpretation of the law, not a matter of policy preference, end quote. That law is based on a Trump-era memo by the DOJ that said prisoners whose sentences lasted beyond the state of emergency were to report back to prison once it was over.
This decision has received pushback from a bipartisan group of criminal justice advocates from more than 20 different advocacy groups, including the ACLU, NAACP, and Amnesty International. Rachel, even if this is technically correct on the legal merits, doesn't the White House have vast discretion over what it can do? And why wouldn't they just say, you know what, if you've been home for the last year and you've been fine, why do we need to lock you back up?
It would
What's
seem
driving
like,
this?
Yeah, it would seem like they do have some discretion here, just based on the fact that the Trump OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, was able to, reverse it. It seems like there is some discretion there. And then I do think the CARES Act contains some provisions giving the executive a little more discretion here as well. What's interesting to me, we said the ACLU, sort of these groups that are advocating for this. The New York Times article also mentions some conservative groups as well that are on the side of this, including FreedomWorks, Senator Chuck Grassley, also making comments to this effect. So it does seem like there's a little bit of a bipartisan coalition here, probably along the lines of that propelled the First Step Act, during the Trump administration. But it does seem to be a little bit quirky. If you have people out of jail that aren't committing crimes and are showing up for their registered appointments, why would you ship them back? COVID is still going on, and also it's pretty expensive to have people, locked up like this.
Right. It's part of our, fetish for punishment and this Puritan hostility that we display on such a regular basis. Because as you said, if you're just looking at it from a policy perspective, and the goal is to reduce crime, and the goal isn't just punishment for the sake of punishment, then this program's going fine. There's no need to change this. People have ankle bracelets. People are being monitored. If they violate conditions of their release, there are all sorts of remedies that the government has. In fact, we covered a ridiculous case here of Gwen Ivey, who was a woman in her 70s who was released. Who had gotten verbal permission from her PO to go to a computer class, but had not gotten permission in writing. And when the PO called, she was in the class, so she didn't answer the call. And for not answering that call, they threw her back in prison. After some public outcry, they said, "Okay, fine, we'll let her back out." But she still had to spend time in jail, away from her mother, who's in her 90s, who she's taking care of. So we know that they have the remedy at their disposal to throw somebody right back in if they have any reason to. Instead, they're just going out and hauling everybody back in. And it feels a little like the First Step Act in the sense that forcing this massive criminal justice reform movement to fight over these crumbs, to fight over this small number of people who've been granted a tiny amount of mercy, while you still have 2+ million people locked away and the system itself is not being touched.
That's a great point. I do think what might be going on here too a little bit is, the New York Times makes mention of this, is that if you're going to have people out of jail, right, it's much more of a resources question to monitor them, right? When they're all locked up in the same place, it's resources, but they're all right there. And I do think sometimes one of the tensions that...
They're saying it's more resource intensive when they're out?
When they're out, right? Because you have to check in with people on a case-by-case basis, all these things. That may or may not be true. That's sort of the reference point that the New York Times settles on. But I think one of the tensions in the defund the police movement that hasn't quite reconciled itself is that if you're going to have fewer people in prison, which I do think should be, a goal, a public policy goal, you do need more resources on the side of some enforcement. You need people checking in. We were mentioning before in the break that, my father was a probation officer for 30 years, right? It takes a lot to actually, check in with people. And so if you want this outcome, I do think you need sort of some specific resourcing in that direction. But the conversation in Congress, who's responsible for those resources, has sort of broken down, into this, if you're funding any sort of law enforcement, you're doing it wrong.
Right. I mean, and ultimately, I think that any cost-benefit analysis, if you wanted to take this issue and just measure it there, would show that for reasons of economic growth alone, you're going to be much better off, fiscally and financially as a community, having people out of prison, and then if you want to create jobs to monitor those bracelets, fine. I really doubt the idea that ultimately it's cost saving to take people who could be productive to society and instead take them out of society and stick them in a cage and then pay people to watch over them. There's just no way.
They're both resource intensive. I think it's just a matter of making a choice, right? And to your point.
And one is resource intensive toward productive.
Toward an end, correct.
And one is destructive.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what's your take? If the Biden administration is going to actually act on this, do you think there'll be pressure from Congress, or?
Hopefully that they will see the error in this and face so much public pressure that they'll back down on it. But it would be in in that category of the very least they can do, and the least they can do is still something they ought to do, because these are real lives at stake. But it is frustrating that we keep fighting these kind of rearguard actions rather than being able to look more broadly at the bigger system, because this would be an opportunity to say, you know what? Let's pilot some of the criminal justice reforms that people have been talking about. The swift and certain, which is saying, look, it flows from the premise that nobody wants to go to prison. That should be a pretty broadly accepted premise, but people don't really understand what the implications of that are. So if you assume that nobody wants to go to prison, then nobody wants to go to prison for a week just as much as they don't want to go to prison for a year. And so the idea is that these draconian multi-year sentences are not actually having a deterrent effect that is at all related to the marginal increase of the sentence. In other words, if you tell someone who's on parole or probation that if they violate their parole or probation, that they're going to jail for a week or for a weekend, that turns out to have just as much of a deterrent effect as if you tell them that you're going for a year. And because we have these year or year plus sentences hanging over people's heads, people like your dad, probation officers, then use a lot more of their discretion before they violate somebody. It's like, you know what? Yes, your piss test came back dirty, but I'm not going to send you to prison for 5 years for a dirty piss test. Just don't do it again. And so then that creates in people this uncertainty about whether or not they're going to get caught. And so then it has less of a kind of incentivizing effect on their behavior. And so people say, no, make it swift and certain. You violated your conditions here. You get 24 hours and back in. And then people understand, okay, then I'm not going to do that because I understand what the actual consequences are. So you could pilot some of those ideas with these people who are out for compassionate use. Instead, they're like, you know what? Send them all a letter and tell them to report back to prison.
Well, I think that's a really good point that you raised, too, that so much of our justice system is built around these perverse incentives or things that people just don't understand, or even if judges want to have discretion in sentencing, they cannot. And so all of this, the Biden administration can only go so far. A lot of this is going to require legal change. And so that's going to be on Congress, which has a packed agenda until August. So we'll see if they get to it.
Yeah. And they're not interested in anything except the model nonviolent pot smoking prisoner. Anything other than that, they're like, I don't know about the politics of that. But so we'll have more Rising for you right after this.